Welcome to Lecture 6 of Origins of Art. This lecture covers pages 29 to 49 of the Eibel Eibesfeld article. In this lecture, we're going to shift our attention from adaptations that make cultural transmission and art behavior possible to adaptations that shape the form that art behavior takes. In this course, we're focusing on cross-cultural patterns in art behavior. This includes things that humans universally find attractive, recurrent patterns, motifs, and subjects in art, and features that art objects and performances have in common. Last week we saw that one of the universal features of art behavior is that it's a form of display. It's aimed at attracting attention and moving the audience. When you stop and think about it then, art behavior is actually two behaviors: making or performing art, which is the role of the artist, and observing art objects and performances, which is the role of the audience, or in modern environments, the consumer. The article assigned for this lecture thus raises two questions at the heart of this course. Why do we perceive some things in our environment as being attractive? And why do we create objects and patterns with aesthetic appeal? The first question addresses the phenomenon of consuming art, and the second question addresses the phenomenon of producing art. Eibel Eibesfeld focuses largely on the first question. We'll be addressing the second question in more detail later in the course. It's important to note that Eibel Eibesfeld is using the terms beautiful and aesthetic appeal very broadly. He's using them to refer to the attention-getting and emotionally arousing aspects of art objects and performances. Understanding why art objects and performances attract our attention and arouse us emotionally begins with understanding the role of aesthetic responses. This, in turn, begins with understanding the role of the emotions. Emotions could not have evolved unless the behavior they evoked tended to increase their bearer's fitness. The pleasing taste of fruit motivates individuals to consume it. Sexual arousal motivates individuals to engage in sex. In other words, emotions motivate responses to environmental stimuli that in ancestral environments recurrently affected survival and reproduction. Interest motivates us to pay attention. Fear motivates us to run away, freeze, or prepare to defend ourselves. Pleasure motivates us to continue doing what we're doing. Thus, emotions are adaptations whose function is to guide behavior. Aesthetic responses and preferences are emotions too. They are feelings we have in response to entities, objects, and phenomena in our environment. We have aesthetic responses to many things in our environment that aren't objects or performances. For example, vivid sunsets, cute babies, and aromatic foods and flowers. The state of being interested in something is an emotional state, as is the opposite state of being bored. To experience something as pleasing, beautiful, amusing, exciting, or awe-inspiring, words often used in response to art objects and performances, is to experience an emotional state. As Eibel Eibesfeld explains, aesthetic responses are perceptual biases. Our perceptual systems are biased in specific ways so that not everything appeals equally to our senses and cognition. To put it another way, the mind has evolved mechanisms that motivate us to pay more attention to some stimuli than others. The function of perceptual biases is to direct attention to potentially beneficial or hazardous entities in our environment. For example, to help us detect the presence of water, game, or predators. Perceptual biases did not evolve for art production, but they play an important role in art behavior because they influence what we find attention-getting and emotionally arousing. Whether consciously or unconsciously, artists tap into these perceptual biases to grab our attention and engage our senses. As Eibel Eibesfeld explains, in art behavior, the basic characteristics of aesthetic perception are used as a means to catch and retain the attention of the observer to convey encoded messages. Indeed, he defines art behavior as the skill to manipulate the mechanisms which underlie our perceptual bias to trigger aesthetic experiences. Eibel Eibesfeld discusses three types of perceptual biases: basic biases, species-specific biases, and cultural biases. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the first two. We'll begin by looking at basic perceptual biases. These biases are basic because complex life forms need them to make sense of their environment and respond to it in ways that are likely to result in their continued survival and/or reproduction. These mechanisms are designed to detect order in the chaos of sights, sounds, and scents in the world around us. One example is the tendency to see a dark figure against a light background rather than vice versa. This is illustrated in the Rubens cup illusion shown at the top of the slide. In the picture on the left, it's easier for most people to detect the two faces than the vase. In contrast, in the picture on the right, the vase leaps out at the viewer, while the faces are harder to see. This bias reflects a regular feature of the environment. in which we often see dark figures or silhouettes against the brightness of the sky. Another attention-getting feature of the environment is pattern. Since many animals have patterned coats or skin, this bias is very useful for detecting both predators and prey. Yet another attention-getting feature of the environment is contrast, which is used to detect the edges of objects and topographical features. This is important for navigating the landscape and also for discerning the shape of objects, which is critical to identifying them. A giraffe, for example, has a very different shape from a lion. Since many organisms are also symmetrical, symmetry is a cue that an entity is a living thing and thus potentially beneficial or harmful. Accordingly, perceptual systems are also designed to pay attention to symmetrical entities in the environment. All of these characteristics, pattern, contrast, and symmetry, are employed in the creation of art objects. We'll now turn our attention to species-specific biases, perceptual biases that are unique to humans. As we saw last week, every species occupies a certain ecological niche, and every ecological niche presents a specific set of adaptive problems. Thus, a rabbit faces different problems than a moose, and each has evolved adaptations that are specific to those problems. For a rabbit, survival depends on its attention being grabbed by cues associated with hawks, owls, and other birds of prey. We may thus expect rabbits to find raptor-shaped objects in the sky extremely riveting. In contrast, moose are not vulnerable to predation by birds, so we would not expect raptor-shaped objects in the sky to draw their interest. A species' perceptual systems are designed to detect cues associated with potential benefits and threats in its environment. These cues, or sign stimuli, trigger behavioral responses that tended to increase the species' chances of surviving and/or reproducing. For example, a rabbit may respond to the cue of a raptor-shaped object overhead by fleeing and heading for cover. These cue detection mechanisms are called innate releasing mechanisms. The cue itself, such as the silhouette or flight pattern of a raptor in the sky, is the releaser. It's the stimulus that releases or triggers the behavioral response. A cue may be visual, acoustic, olfactory, or even tactile. One important species-specific perceptual bias that Eibel Eibesfeld talks about is children's faces and bodies. It's no accident that we tend to find babies and small children cute. These emotions motivated parents to take good care of their children, and thus increased children's survival rates. Research indicates that our emotional response to children is motivated by very specific features: a large head relative to the body, large eyes, a small chin, puffy cheeks, short limbs, and rounded features. In art and other imagery, these features are used to evoke cuteness and generate a sympathetic response in the viewer. Another perceptual bias that Eibel Eibesfeld discusses is the fierce or angry face, which is characterized by bulging, staring eyes. As we saw when we looked at theory of mind, all agents have adaptations for detecting eye direction. So, as agents, humans are predisposed to find faces and eyes attention-getting, be they animal or human. But, as we also saw, humans have adaptations for recognizing human facial expressions, including anger. So human faces are especially attention-getting for us, because navigating the social environment is so dependent on inferring people's emotional state from their facial expression. On top of that, in many animals, including humans, staring is perceived as threatening or dominating behavior. This might be because predators fixate on prey before attacking. So large staring eyes arrest our attention and may make us feel nervous or vulnerable. Eibel Eibesfeld notes that apotropaic images, that is, images used to ward off harm or evil, are common cross-culturally and often feature large staring eyes. The use of these images is rooted in apotropaic magic, which is the use of good luck charms or gestures, such as amulets, crossing your fingers, or knocking on wood. Eibel Eibesfeld also notes that certain gestural elements appear cross-culturally in art. Phallic symbols are a case in point. Although commonly associated with fertility, Eibel Eibesfeld argues that in apotropaic art they signal dominance or threat. His reasoning is that these images and gestures are aimed at repelling threats, and in many species, dominance is demonstrated through the use of mounting or sexual display. Another important bias that Eibel Eibesfeld discusses is color. Colors are perceived in a similar way cross-culturally. Yellow and red are perceived as warm colors, while blue is perceived as a calm color. Red is especially attention-getting and sometimes alarming, perhaps due to its association with ripe fruit and blood. Our bodies respond in different ways to different colors. For example, warm colors activate the autonomous nervous system, raising the heart rate and blood pressure. And rooms painted red-orange are perceived as being 3 to 4 degrees warmer than rooms painted blue-green, even when both are the same temperature. Humans also exhibit biases to lightness and darkness. People tend to attach positive value to brightness and negative value to darkness. It's unlikely that this bias is rooted in skin color, because before our species migrated out of Africa and began colonizing different ecological zones, there was probably little variation in skin color among human populations. Rather, the light-dark bias is probably related to our being a diurnal species, which makes it hard for us to see dangers at night, and thus makes darkness scary for us. Finally, we also have perceptual biases related to movement. One of these is known as the looming response, which consists of a fear response to dark objects that are rapidly approaching from above. This reaction is believed to be an evolved response to the threat of airborne predators, such as a raptor diving in for the kill or a leopard attacking from a tree, or to falling objects such as rocks or branches. In experimental studies, 2-week-old babies react to the projection of dark, symmetrically expanding blotches with clear avoidance responses. Since humans aren't the only animal that's been vulnerable to this threat, the looming response may be something that we share with certain other species. As you can see, aesthetic responses aren't limited to experiences of beauty. Disgust is a case in point. Disgust is classified as one of the basic emotions and is also one of the 6 facial expressions universally recognized by humans. The disgust response is associated with a stereotypical action: opening the mouth, sticking out the tongue, and closing the nostrils. It's also associated with a physiological response, nausea, and an emotional state, revulsion. The things that humans commonly find disgusting are bodily waste, things like feces, urine, mucus, and vomit, and spoilage or decay, things like rotten meat or fruit. These are all things that can make us sick if we ingest them. The function of the disgust response, then, is to discourage the ingestion of harmful substances. The feeling of nausea makes us want to avoid ingesting the substance in question, and the facial movements involved in the response serve to expel whatever is in the mouth. Note that this is an olfactory as well as a visual perceptual bias. It's triggered by the smell of these items as well as their appearance. Modern art often exploits this response to arouse the audience. Duchamp's fountain, a machine-made urinal displayed as sculpture, is a case in point. Even though the urinal is clean, the negative reaction that many people have to this work is probably rooted, in part, in the association of urinals with bodily waste. One really interesting finding in the study of perceptual biases is that when a cue or releaser is exaggerated, a stronger response is triggered. This is known as the peak shift effect, and it's been well studied in rats. If a rat is taught to discriminate a square from a rectangle and rewarded for the rectangle, it will soon learn to respond more frequently to the rectangle. Once they've been trained to do this, rats respond more strongly to a rectangle that is longer and skinnier than the one they were trained on. The explanation for this is that, in the longer, skinnier rectangle, cues of rectangleness, that is, uneven side lengths, are exaggerated, which amplifies the signal, or makes it stronger. Ramachandran argues that this is essentially what artists do. As he puts it, what the artist tries to do, either consciously or unconsciously, is to not only capture the essence of something, but also to amplify it in order to more powerfully activate the same neural mechanisms that would be activated by the original object. The ability of artists to abstract the essential features of an image and discard redundant information is essentially what our perceptual biases do. They point our attention and interest to those aspects of an object or entity that are most relevant to survival and/or reproduction. Another interesting finding is what Eibel Eibesfeld calls the principle of Gut Gestalt. Our perceptual system strives to perceive regularity and symmetry in our environment to make sense of the world around us. When a form lacks these things, the mind tends to project them onto the perceived object. Artists may consciously or unconsciously take advantage of this by creating forms that stop short of perfection. This engages the viewer's attention by stimulating corrective activity on the part of the viewer's mind. For example, when we look at the Picasso drawing shown in the slide, our mind corrects the picture by filling in the blanks, which enables us to make sense of the form. When we look at the Chuck Close painting, our mind integrates the exaggerated pixels to create order out of chaos. The takeaway message of this lecture is that humans have evolved perceptual biases that direct their attention and guide their responses to potentially beneficial or harmful environmental stimuli. Perceptual biases include positive and negative emotional responses, such as the pleasure we experience in response to the taste of fruit and the fear we experience in response to looming objects. Our improvisational intelligence enables us to create artifacts that mimic releasing stimuli. Individuals can use these artificial stimuli to produce an emotional response in themselves or in others. Art objects and performances often take advantage of evolved perceptual biases to signal and/or arouse both positive and negative emotions. One example we saw of this was the fierce face, which is prominently featured in the haka dance traditionally used by the Maori to intimidate their enemies. Note that in this particular cultural context, the fierce face is combined with the disgust face. Another example is the use of the light-dark bias and the looming effect in film noir and horror films to arouse fear and anxiety in the audience. As shown in the middle photo, large shadows are used to suggest the approach of a threatening agent, and darkness is used to suggest uncertainty and danger. Finally, as noted earlier, the use of the disgust effect is illustrated in Duchamp's fountain, in which the association with bodily waste arouses disgust. This concludes Lecture 6. In the next lecture, we'll look at perceptual biases in the context of habitat selection.